So it's absolutely essential that MEV is not a centralizing force that washes out small validators in sort of the intra-chain case. In the intra-chain case, of which there's similar dynamics, of which like if you have presence on multiple networks, like Cosmos Hub, Osmosis, Evmos, and Juno, right? There are maybe a handful of validators that are in the top, let's say 20, including FRENS, by the way. And that gives them a privileged position to co-sequence. So they could potentially sequence blocks across.
Address that. I think that's what we're very adamant about, that the value chain needs to be represented in the protocols natively and need to have like some upside along the way, right? Like,
would this structure be more favorable for us as an industry from a regulatory perspective?
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Welcome to another episode on this YouTube channel, and I announced it on Twitter already. The MEV series go on, and it's very interesting because we had Sunny Agarwal on the show recently talking about MEV. We had Skip, and today we will view the topic of MEV from a different angle together with Mekatek. And today I'm very happy to welcome Sean and XLA to the show. Hey guys, such a pleasure to have you on. How are you doing, guys?
Thank you for having us. Glad to be here.
yeah, indeed.
Yeah, and
Pleasure is ours.
yeah, 100%. Pleasure is mine. So from that end, but before we really dive deeper into this MEV topic that everybody's talking about at the moment, I think it would be super helpful if you could briefly introduce yourself, because that's your first time on the channel. So could you elaborate very briefly what you have been working on so far, and how you entered the MEV market, so to say?
Maybe XLA, do you want to go first?
Sure. Maybe I start with how Brebs and I met way back when in Web2 land. We used to work for SoundCloud a decade ago and started our friendship there. And along the way, went different paths. I went into other endeavors, ended up somehow on the Tenement core team for a while, and have been doing some work in open source funding and decentralized GitHub alternatives. And since beginning of this year, working on Mekatek exclusively with Brebs.
Actually, that's true. Do you know that like how many times you've gotten me a job, XLA?
Handful.
So like the first time it was at SoundCloud where he like onboarded me. And then the second time, so we worked at SoundCloud for like 5 years or something together, all in Berlin, with a bunch of friends that now work at Mekatek actually. And then we both went in separate directions. I went into banking, so I started a bank for migrants, which ended up having a crypto angle. And then eventually stepped out of that because I wanted to work more at like the core technology level instead of the let's say regulatory level. I guess running a financially regulated money transmitter comes with certain restrictions that were somehow confined in the set of technology that we could use. So he was working at Tenement Core, and it looked like fun. So I just started contributing open source to the code base with his guidance, and then ended up working at the ICF. And then when the ICF, let's say, fractured or so reconfigured to form informal, I stepped in as a CTO and oversaw the development there, where we shipped stuff like Hermes and IBC and light clients and formal verification tooling, like a lot of cool stuff. And then we worked again. Actually, XLA and I worked again under the informal umbrella, sort of on IBC. And then we wanted to rewrite Tendermint in Rust, which took several false starts. And the final ones, we sort of determined that we need to sort of change the way that we think about funding models, the way that we think about political economies in Cosmos, and how we think about composition of the core Tendermint stack, or of the core Cosmos stack, really. So at the time, I was sort of a community member of like Flashbots, trying to figure out how auctions work, and very interested in MEV as a potential significant, like dominant revenue source in our ecosystem. And then we kind of took those two desires together and formed Mekatek to focus really on interchain block space markets and figuring out how to make those fair, efficient, and ready for growth.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of keywords here, and we will definitely talk about them as well. Especially flashbots and in a cross-chain world is a very, very interesting topic. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
also find it so exciting that you took the road from working in the traditional financial ecosystem and then moving towards the crypto industry. But now you mentioned MEV for the very first time already. Let's talk about MEV. So I know there are very controversial views on it, and there are also big differences between the MEV on Ethereum and Cosmos. So let's start this interview from a very broad perspective. Like, let's explain it to me like I'm 5. What is MEV essentially all about if I do not have any clue about MEV whatsoever?
So luckily you've had two teams to kind of contribute their perspective. So I'll try and build on their understanding towards something more, let's say, broad. So MEV in short is like the unique value that the sequencer of transaction has in the network. So like as a miner in Ethereum 1, as a validator in Ethereum 2, as a block proposer in Tendermint-based Cosmos chains, you are currently uniquely privileged with sole authority per slot to sequence transactions. And the maximum amount of myopic revenue, so as in the amount of money you make for that one thing, propose a single block that you extract is the MEV in that block. I think that it is a hot button issue, and I think one of the sources of the controversy is this understanding of like, should validators have that privilege? Would be one question. As like, should they have the rights? Is it better for the ecosystem to privilege a single party with the ability to extract? That's like first level. And the second level is, when we think about blockchains, do we think of them as driven by market forces or by public goods? So is the blockchain itself just a utility where people contribute to it to optimize social welfare, or is it a market where people sort of discover the value of different operations? So there's like kind of 3 levels of complexity there.
But there's the flip side to the right of the sequencing is also, do you need to be specialized as a validator, as a proposer? Or is it actually too exclusive if you also need to be a good block producer and a good block builder?
Yeah, and I think this issue is coming up more and more as the regulatory environment heats up, and this privilege of sequencing transactions also becomes a responsibility. So if you are the one deciding on what's in the block, do you have to, say, adhere to sanctions? When OFAC releases a bunch of addresses, do you have to censor those transactions? So it's controversial because it's ongoing how we want this to go as an ecosystem.
Yeah, that's actually something that I've heard from a very first time, but it's actually very obvious. So is this something also regulators have on their radar already? Because if I follow all these regulatory discussions, especially in Europe at the moment when they had this unhosted wallet discussion, I don't really think that they understand MEV yet, or I can't really imagine that there are these kinds of discussions already. But are there discussions on the table already discussing especially this?
Right. So coming at it from the regulatory perspective, there is the question of if validators are intermediaries. Are they facilitating payment orders? If the transaction has a source and a destination, in the current regulatory regime, that would make you a money transmitter. Would you have to be licensed in, let's say, every state of which your users operate? So you'd have to know every single user and what state they're in to make sure that you have a license before facilitating that transaction, if it were to go that extreme. I think that from the validators, we've been holding extensive conversations with validators about this very issue, as well as regulators. And this is one of the motivations why validators no longer want to be responsible for block construction. They want to outsource it, and then they want to have some kind of plausible neutrality to the contents of the block. They don't want to know what's in the block because they don't want to be responsible for it.
For a similar reason, you could say that the lack of incentivization for IBC relayers has the same fundamental problems of like, when are you an intermediary? When do you fall into that category?
Yeah, yeah. And but follow-up question here, because you, Sean, you mentioned this worst case scenario, so to say. How far are we away from this? Because I can imagine if this law would get introduced by tomorrow, a lot of validators would struggle, and therefore, I mean, almost every validator would struggle, because I believe even the big validators do not have this license yet. So what would happen in this case with the Cosmos infrastructure if almost no validators are able to run, to run their business anymore? Is this a real danger for Cosmos actually?
I don't think the conversations are sort of globally advanced to the point where there'd be sort of like a unified ruling. I think that there'd be like a sequence of rulings that would probably happen in one jurisdiction. Probably the States, the United States has had a tendency to lead on financial regulation, while Europe has a tendency to follow, but that's changing. I think that there is a tremendous amount of pushback, so there is much more crypto-focused lobbying activities happening already with this particular agenda in mind. So I think that the concerns are sort of well represented, but it's very difficult to predict actually how the policy agenda is going to advance and how quickly.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, it totally makes sense. But yeah, let's hope that regulators won't go too crazy after validators. Let's hope we win some time, at least. But what I want to move this discussion forward is, let's get to the beginning of MEV. So when I heard about MEV for the very first time was when I read the blog post about whether Ethereum is a dark forest or not. So I think this was when MEV became controversial for the very first time. So could you elaborate maybe a little bit, XLA, on this Medium blog post? Could you maybe explain to us why MEV was such a big thing on Ethereum, or is?
Why is MEV such a big thing on Ethereum? I mean, because it's the biggest crypto market that exists as of now. And to your question about the blog posts, it's more or less a narrative around what you are exposed when you partake in the mempool, right? And what kind of dynamics exist. And also who is incentivized to do what, and what will be deployed in order to make sure that you are found and these opportunities are found in the mempool, and to what lengths people will go and what kind of sophistication, which just shows that there's enough return for going that deep and this sophisticated. And I think a similar or like a good comparison is how advanced high frequency trading is in stock markets, right? To the point where they build custom infrastructure to the exchange and measuring the wires, the lengths, so that they have equal competitive advantage. Yeah, and I think that's really it. Like Ethereum is currently the biggest market, like in itself, and all its apps and protocols that run on top of it. So it's always gonna be proportionally giving more MEV opportunity than any other outlet.
Yeah, makes sense. And I asked this question in this way because obviously Ethereum is also especially the largest DeFi market, and we can find lots of MEV due to DeFi. I also know this one graph that basically also was very correlated with the growth of DeFi, which was very interesting. But yeah, that's an obvious reason. But like, I mean, we all know that the Cosmos infrastructure and the architecture of Cosmos is very, very different from Ethereum. So we have these use case specific blockchains. We have a cross-chain infrastructure. And here's my question for you, Sean. Why should we in Cosmos care about that if this topic is so big on Ethereum and not yet that big in Cosmos? And also we have a completely different infrastructure. So why could MEV become so relevant for Cosmos? And I think you know where I'm hitting on cross-chain MEV.
Oh yeah, no, I think the big risk of MEV coming to Cosmos is going to be a centralizing force. Like the biggest risk is that a subset of the validators, usually the big ones, primarily extract disproportionate amount of the value, then they compound that value to sort of dominate the network. And if Cosmos is a well-governed system, if it is, say, dare I say it, a democracy, and specifically not populism, it's absolutely essential that that Cosmos maintain the rights of minorities being small validators. If you're a large validator extracting disproportionate amount of revenue, then it's very, very difficult to allow smaller validators to take part in that economy. And it's usually the small validators that bring in new ideas because they have smaller jurisdictions, they have more flexibility, they have less to lose, they don't have institutional clients, they're just like small community members. They are the ones that propose the ideas that are going to move the network forward, I would argue. So it's absolutely essential that MEV is not a centralizing force that washes out small validators in sort of in the intra-chain case. In the intra-chain case, of which there's similar dynamics, of which, like, if you have presence on multiple networks, if you just take four, like Cosmos Hub, Osmosis, Evmos, and Juno, right? There are maybe a handful of validators that are in the top, let's say 20, including FRENS, by the way, in those networks, and that gives them a privileged position to co-sequence, so they can potentially sequence blocks across those blockchains and have much lower risk of performing certain operations than, say, someone going over IBC or just YOLOing it with the FIFO mempool markets. And so this is a huge risk to the sovereignty thesis of Cosmos as an ecosystem, which is supposed to be about the community computer, is supposed to be about community values, specifically those that defend minorities, and there's supposed to be diversity across the zones such that more communities can explore different ideas in parallel. If it's always the same people at the top of the validator list extract disproportionate revenue, then what are the chances that those communities are going to explore different ideas and actually figure out this thing we call blockchain? I don't know. Pretty bad.
And from this potential risk on, you mentioned the threat that may be around the corner, especially when Cosmos becomes bigger. So what would be a very good way, in your view, to democratize the access to MEV and to basically take away this huge power that some validators have?
Well, I think the big validators that have all the power are actually quite willing to give away that responsibility, as it seems, of block building. So what we need to do is, or one way to solve this, I won't speak with sort of authority because it's a little bit too early to say that one thing is going to work better than another, or demonstrably better, because nothing has been demonstrated, is essentially we need a builder layer. We need sort of like a network of builders to sort of compete on the open market for the most optimal block construction of the interchain block space. So in that way, then it's absolutely essential that the builders are sort of proposer neutral and will distribute the rewards and the upside to any validator, big or small, proportionate, again, to their voting power and not to the size of their organization or how early they were in some funding round or anything like that.
So can I imagine this a little bit like a huge market, so to say?
The bigger, the better. If it's a unified builder, then we've just moved the centralization to one place. So that's not great. That would essentially lower the. One of the biggest concerns that we have with the builder layer is censorship. So if you have a large amount of people that are willing to build blocks, then any user can probably find execution in one of them. If there's a single block builder, then essentially they could threaten liveness of the entire network or censor any transaction. So that would be where, so it has to be a layer, and it has to be populated with people that ideally disagree on the best way to build a block.
So just to wrap this a little bit up and put this into the right perspective, so this approach would be all about splitting the whole process into new parts. So as of now, we have basically So for example, on Ethereum, where the miners can basically do everything, and now the idea is to introduce a new layer where the block where the block production takes place. Correct?
Yeah.
In reality, we have monolithic chains at the moment. Everything happens in one single vertically integrated thing. And then you have this composability thesis, right, with Celestia popping up. And in the Ethereum research, some of that touches on that is called PBS, which is the proposer-builder separation, where the research goes in the direction to actually trying to untangle that, make them distinct actors in the system that have well understood and well researched incentives, and also hopefully are punishable economically. So they have skin in the game, and whatever usually expressed in stake. They go even a bit further by saying also execution should be separate, where you can just apply the state machine and do that separately. And if you have all of that separate, then you can see specialization in each of those. And that specialization helps to ultimately produce better results, right? Like what you want is you want the entire value chain. So everyone from the so-called user, which is usually the actor that people want to protect, right? Like friends don't let other friends steal grandma slippage. That's usually what they're all after. But there's so many more involved actors that go from like that transaction being sent to that transaction being settled and representing some interaction on the chain. And I think to answer a bit to that question before, like how do you want to address that? I think that's what we're very adamant about, that the value chain needs to be represented in the protocols natively and need to have like some upside along the way, right? Like for the service you provide, you need to have some form of remuneration.
Yeah, that's I love the comparison with grandma and friends, by the way. But what I want to touch base on right now, because we brought this approach on the table here, would this also be a better circumstances or a better environment for regulators to understand this environment between the validators, an underlying network, and also the new relayer that handles the block production? Would this structure be more favorable for us as an industry from a regulatory perspective?
I think that we are moving the centralization point away from consensus into this block builder thing. And block builders are going to have to adhere to and respect a set of preferences for a whole bunch of different reasons, right? One of them might be regulatory. Another might be like, if you're working with institutional clients that specify no sandwich attacks because, we know in financial markets that it's illegal, then there will be a block builder that essentially has to create a valuable block based on those preferences to get execution. That's going to be their job. There are going to be some block builders that have specific determinations of what good and bad MEV is, and then they're going to have to essentially construct blocks that are profitable enough. That's going to be their job. Their business is going to live and die by their ability to create profitable blocks that respect those preferences. So there'll be many, and hopefully they'll compete, and they will be in different jurisdictions. So if it's decentralized, they'll have to reflect the laws of those jurisdictions.
I get it. And based on all of that, how does Mekatek come into play here? Because we talked a lot about MEV, about the potential issues. So what are you guys building? Because many of our viewers may not have heard of you guys. So how are you guys coming into this play?
So initially we were trying to give market making to Cosmos for free. It was like what we initially wanted to do as an experiment in discovering the nature of interchain block space markets. And then we kind of had like two choices. Like if we wanted to do it and do it like profitably, we could have like inferred the network topology of Cosmos based chains and figure out where the proposals are to get the best execution, and then we would always get top of block because we would just like seek out crawl AWS, crawl Google Cloud, figure out where validators are, or bribe them, or something like this, some nefarious construction that would make the overall ecosystem more fragile, to actually improve liquidity of the interchain. But then it seemed like kind of a waste of time in the end, as like keeping that infrastructure up to date would be bad. And I don't think that Mekatek is probably the best person in the long run to maintain optimal block construction for every chain, for every case. So we look to sort of standardize both the APIs and the mechanism of which optimal block construction can happen. And we're going to have several versions of that. Like the first version is going to be like a centralized block builder, where you could essentially compete in an open auction for a type of blocks to make sure that the actual value of that transaction is priced in, and validators and stakers get paid proportionally. That version will come with various trust assumptions, which you'll see over the evolution of Mekatek, and we will look to improve upon. But essentially, we're trying to build that layer in an iterative form, like the builder layer, multiple iterations, from centralized to better trust assumptions over time, to essentially facilitate optimal block construction in the interchain.
Get it. And now from an architecture perspective, how can I imagine Mekatek? Like maybe a pleb question, but how is the infrastructure designed at Mekatek? So are you a protocol? Would you see yourself more like a company? So how can I imagine this? How everything works behind the scenes, or do you even have a set of validators? So how are you actually handling the block producing part?
So Mekatek is a group of people, an organization which attempts to build protocols for this exact problem, to solve this exact problem, right? The efficient block space market for the interchain. That's our catchphrase. And the first iteration that Brabs hinted at is an intermediary where searchers, so usually that's referred to the actors who see opportunity that they want to get at, right? They want to be the first to take the opportunity, take the arbitrage, for example, or whatever else they want to do. So you have on that side the searchers, on the other side the validators, which going to integrate on an API, which is open, documented, and ideally permissionless, right? Anyone can participate. And that is more or less an auction. So the searchers compete with their bids and say, I want to bid this amount, which hopefully in an efficient market is close to the extracted value anyway. And that bid is then paid out in part to the block builder, right? In between, the majority to the validator. And that's the first iteration that we're working on. But ultimately, we are an organization committed to building protocols, as we call it with escalating odds, right? We want to start very focused, and then our next step would be to bring it natively into the Cosmos software, into the protocols itself, the Cosmos SDK, for people who are familiar. And going from there, then the long-term goal is to have that builder layer. So really like a decentralized version of all of that, which is not controlled by a single entity. As Rep said, trust minimization and decentralization are the two guiding principles, the guardrails, which we work along. And that is how we build the trajectory.
Okay, so this is like kind of your roadmap, so to say. But as of now, just to make like very clear, so I can imagine Mekatek right now as a wireless interconnected auction house. So this is like the initial vision of this, correct? Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
I think that's a fair comparison.
Okay, yeah, and now that we talked also about this infrastructure, and I know, Sean, you mentioned already good MEV versus bad MEV. So we had two guests on this show recently that talked about good and bad MEV, and also to be fair and to make this very clear, they also said that this is mainly to facilitate this very complex topic to people who are new to MEV. So what is your view on this meme, good MEV and bad MEV? Is it maybe confusing, or will this lead the conversation into the wrong direction? So could you share your opinion on that real quick?
So I guess Mekatek is pretty MEV neutral. We don't make designations over good and bad. And the motivation there is because for us, we're trying to internalize as much MEV as possible is the objective, specifically to make sure that it doesn't become an off-chain centralizing force. I think that's the biggest risk to the ecosystem for us is validator centralization, or like profit centralization, which leads to validator centralization, and not bad execution of swap transactions. So we don't really focus on that. We think there are probably other people that could focus on that.
I see. XLA, maybe you want to add something to this as well, to this meme?
Yeah. I think it's a funny notion to think of something as lawful and unlawful, right? Good and bad. It highly depends. It highly depends. And going back to what Sean expanded on, is this expression of preference. In the end, it's a very complex, multidimensional problem where like a lot of preferences need to be considered in order for it to be satisfied. But we also see MEV as a forcing function. Right? If you can exploit a mechanism like slippage in a DEX, for example, then maybe your mechanism design isn't fully refined yet. Maybe there's another iteration of what you can build as a DApp or protocol. And by surfacing that, right, having that forcing function, we hope that from the layer one, the consensus stability, up to the protocols that are directly used by users, that they all come out the other end improved and like somewhat the wiser, I would say.
Yeah, so just to extend it a little bit, I think there's like a lot of different ways or there are emergent design space of DEX design, which is meant to solve a lot of these problems, and they are sort of competing. And one of the things that led to our stance, let's say, is a set of questions over like what preferences people are asking for and adhering to, which is something that we actually measure. So for instance, it became very difficult for us to reason about the difference between like a user paying a 2% slippage premium for getting sandwiched versus getting quoted a higher price by a market maker. Like a market maker would probably sit on both sides and provide liquidity at exactly the point that is profitable to them. Actually, that is mostly their profit motive, is literally giving a user a worse price than they would get if they were not there, right? And on larger exchanges that are like more mature markets, market making is like 50% of volume. So it's very hard to say whether that is necessary or not to the user experience. A lot of people would argue that it's absolutely essential for market makers to make money before a DEX is going to get any kind of liquidity, where you're going to get any kind of good execution anyways, would be one argument. Another argument is that if you take the sort of most nefarious kind of MEV of sandwich attacks, right, which meaningfully, let's say, or marginally increase the volume on the DEX and specifically payments to LPs, the question is like, do LPs deserve some kind of tax extraction from the users for exposure to impermanent loss? I think it's a protocol specific question. Some protocols try to compensate liquidity providers with inflation, which is essentially a tax on everyone. The question is like, who should be taxed and what? And it isn't quite clear to me that our ecosystem, either on Ethereum or Cosmos or Polkadot or anything, has like a hard and fast answer to that. And I think what's most important is to allow multiple ideas to experiment in parallel and see which one catches on. That includes, on Crescent DEX, they have batch execution, which essentially socializes, or let's say, not great execution for a larger set of people. Is that better? I don't know. Let's see what the volume is on Crescent DEX in 6 months. We need to figure that out.
I see. So to bring this a little bit together, so your argument is that this meme, good versus bad MEV, is not too productive in this discussion because it's also a very protocol specific question, and we are still in the very early phase where we figure out things, where we will see where we will end up to to one day, right?
Or concretely, like, I think what would be convincing to me is to do like a comparison of like execution quality reports on different dexes and to see which one is better. Where execution quality is like, how many times do I have to retry the transaction? So if I like try a transaction with a small slip of tolerance and it fails, and then I get a worse price next time, what's the difference between like doing it the first time versus getting the worst price the second time? It becomes my time preference. I have to like keep clicking that fucking button just to get my transaction to go through because the slip of tolerance is too low. Is that better? Do I pay higher fees? Like the fees on failed transactions are nominal on Osmosis right now. But if fees on transactions were what they should be, like something that would pay validators, proportion to the value that they create, would the failed transaction still be giving good execution in aggregate? I don't know. Like we're not at that point where we could define where we have those kind of reports yet.
Yeah, and this is also, I guess, also then a user experience question that the protocol has to ask itself. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I think what we can clearly see here is how complex this topic MEV is, and that we are still in a very, very early stage. But I wanted to touch base on an argument that Skip Protocol brought on the table in the last episode about MEV. They also had an interesting theory about how MEV could be a very profitable way for IBC to become at the end of the day profitable, so that in praxis, so that if an IBC relayer picks up a transaction, that he also gets a cut from MEV, so to say. Is this something that you would agree on, XLA? So could MEV also be a very nice way to make IBC a highly profitable technology?
Yeah, I can imagine it for sure. I mean, there are lots of subtlety to that, right? Especially the asynchronicity of IBC being inherently hard to manage. I think what I would be worried about is the same thing why we don't want the necessity for proposers or validators to have specialization, right? To be really good block producers, is you would need a similar specialization as an IBC relayer, right? Because it's not just that the MEV is there and is up for everyone to grab. Like extracting MEV is something that takes, especially in a very competitive market, you have to maintain that edge, right, over time. So you have to stay on top of your game to find opportunity and exploit opportunity. So, and if you, besides providing the service of just relaying IBC packets, right, between different chains, you also now have to worry about becoming really good at finding opportunities and exploiting them. Like, will that ultimately again lead to just a handful of relayers surviving that, because otherwise it's not profitable, right? Again, like our framework that we look at all of these things, is it more or less centralizing, right? Will it lead to more centralization, either through unaccounted externalities, or because it requires a high degree of sophistication in order to participate in that function? Yeah, I don't have an answer to what the alternative would be to make IBC relayers competitive and incentivized. But these would be the things I would look at critically when I would look at MEV extracted by IBC relayers. And I think there might be ample opportunity to do that, right? We don't know if that's already happening. I think also, like, one of the problems we have in the Cosmos ecosystem is that we don't have the greatest visibility into on-chain activity and off-chain activity. I think Ethereum is light years ahead, right? With tools like Dune Analytics and on-chain wizards, which just service the most crazy, nuanced narratives that happen on-chain. So I would be keen to see more of that surface, right? And substantiate, like, is it actually already happening? Are IBC relayers doing that? And also, as an IBC relayer in your position, how much can you actually extract? How much is there actually? How much meat is on the bone? So these are all things that I think are super interesting to explore, but also go into the direction. What is the interchain dynamic, right? The cross-chain dynamic for MEV. Yeah.
Yeah, the other question about IBC relayers extracting MEV is like, how is that revenue going to be distributed? Like, if you have MEV that's generated in one zone but extracted in another, which delegators get paid? Is my principal question. You know, there's a couple concrete cases that are going to be very evident when interchain accounts goes live. So you're going to have, say, transactions of the Cosmos Hub, almost like as a funding entity, that are going to create swaps on osmosis. And you know that like, the Cosmos Hub is going to commit to doing a swap, maybe for a large amount, that is going to have to go over IBC and then be executed on osmosis. So the MEV is generated on the Cosmos Hub, but it's going to be extracted, as in the unique privilege of sequencing, the value of sequencing that transaction is going to be on osmosis. Why would a relayer pay the Cosmos Hub validators for that?
Yeah.
Said another way, why would the Cosmos validators reveal that information?
Yeah, that's actually a very fair point in this discussion. But for me, it becomes once again a little bit clear. This is why I initially asked the question about MEV to make IBC maybe profitable. So we started this interview with Ethereum and MEV on Ethereum, aka the dark forest, with this very traditional infrastructure that we have, one blockchain that still uses proof of work today and will switch to proof of stake at some point, hopefully this year in summer. Let's see. But yeah, like in Cosmos, I see that MEV will become much more complex. And with that in mind, with so many opportunities in mind, for example, what I mentioned with making IBC profitable, with cross-chain MEV, do you think that the Cosmos ecosystem could become the playground for MEV, because this is where MEV could become so prosperous and so complex that we see MEV in so many parts of the Cosmos ecosystem?
I think it's just about volume. Like there's like the asynchronous nature of IBC, which is interesting. There's the fact that there are varying security models. That's interesting. But for MEV, it's not that complicated. It's a volume game. That there will be proportionate between 1% and 0.1% on busy days versus slow days of MEV, proportionate to volume. So when the volume comes back, there'll be more.
And could what I said just a minute before, could this maybe be also like one of the reasons why we could see an increased volume in the Cosmos ecosystem? Because also people would be like willingly also actively use the Cosmos ecosystem more, or that we also see more and more protocols such as DYDX joining the interchain to also have more exposure to their own MEV, so to say, because they are their own chain.
So is your question like whether MEV will be a driving force for the growth? Like, is it a leading or a following force? Okay. I think it'll be a leading force for volume. I think the argument could be made that if you get, because market makers right now, which is usually a driving force for adoption, like spreading liquidity, like the volume is too low. So there's like this sort of chasm right now where the volume is too low for market makers, but like this chicken and egg situation, right? And hopefully some of the stuff we're doing block building will make it more efficient for searchers to do that market making operation versus, you know, inferring the network topology of every Cosmos-based network. I think that will help liquidity come into the ecosystem.
And how are you viewing this, XLA? Could MEV be one of the driving forces for the Cosmos ecosystem to expand?
I think besides the comments on volume and just growth, the fact that it becomes the talking point right now in the ecosystem, right? Everyone is talking about it in one way or another. Just shows that there is vested interest. And I think what is in favor of Cosmos is one could say it has a bit of a YOLO mentality, right? People push very quick, very drastic changes from the software side, from the innovation side. But I think also the sovereign part is that you can experiment in a relatively safe enclave without breaking the entire thing. And that will help, as you said, like the playground for MEV. I think it will help explore different mechanisms, different prevention techniques, right? If you look at projects like Penumbra, and also Anoma has some of that like shielded approach. So I think that is what speaks in Cosmos' favor, right? Like, and maybe one of these is going to prevail, right? One of these techniques, one of these mechanisms, and it's going to ripple through the ecosystem and then be adopted through the common software stack that all of these chains share to a larger or smaller extent. Obviously, we have a very narrow framing, right? Given that our project is an MEV project, obviously for us, that is the bubble that we are in. So it seems to be everything that is going on. So from our perspective, it is an extremely important force to reckon with. And we want to see it being reflected natively and not be an unaccounted externality, right? Like not only finding out the network topology, but maybe colluding with validators or sitting on the wallet order flow. Like these are the mechanisms you have today. And none of that goes back to the validators or the rest of the value chain, right? None of the stakers, none of the developer funds or whatever else you need to sustain over time in order to keep your network healthy.
Yeah, gotcha. And to make all of what we have discussed in the past couple of minutes, to make all of this a little bit more tangible for people who are new to this topic, with all of the extreme developments in mind, for example, the merge on Ethereum, with more chains coming to the interchain, such as DYDX, with the wider expansion of IBC, how do you imagine the MEV market in the next, let's say, 2 to 3 years from now? We saw an immense growth in the Ethereum ecosystem. So how do you envision this, where the MEV market will bring the broader crypto industry in the next couple of years?
If we do nothing, it'll be a very centralizing force. I think that there will be block building across chains, probably including Ethereum. I think block builders will collude in the same way that ad exchanges collude, as in like we'll buy from Flashbots and Flashbots will probably buy from us, but that sort of stuff. I think it's going to get very confusing. And
maybe a nicer outlook. What would be an ideal outcome?
The ideal outcome is for Cosmos to sustain the democratic principles of defending minority rights, to have small validators, people come into the validator set, bring in new ideas and come to prominence. That voting power, the market for voting power and for delegates in Cosmos has to be very competitive. That's the best outcome for Cosmos, I think.
XLA, would you agree on that, or maybe you have something to add on that?
Yeah, and on a positive outlook, similarly, a diverse set of builders, right? Not everyone is going to be good at building for all of these chains because they will have different use cases. If you specialize on liquidations on one, doesn't mean that you're going to be good at exploiting DEX displacement on osmosis, for example. So that would be a positive outcome for the next 2 to 3 years, that there are a healthy amount of builders with a diverse set of utility, because you can always think of that in a negative way, which is you extract value. The other way is you bring utility, which, can coexist, how we now have diverse participants in other parts of the infrastructure.
I see. And because, Sean, you mentioned this worst case scenario, then we talked about this, brighter outlook, so to say. because MEV has become like a more popular topic to talk about in the interchain currently. So where do you see ourselves closer? Like, are we closer to this worst case scenario, or are we moving more into like a brighter future, so to say? So where are we?
I think we are on the trajectory of the banality of evil. That it's like you could talk about it all you want, but you have to like do it. You actually have to improve things. Like validator centralization is happening, and due to no nefarious means. It's just incentives. The incentives right now are to exploit like the superlinear advantages of operating on more networks. I think there are other forces as well. Like there are actual protocol changes that will also incentivize validator centralization. Typhoon will incentivize validator centralization, the work from Monoma, for instance. I think it's a great protocol, but it does have that effect, and I think we need alternatives. Bright future, I don't know. I'm not like I don't take the future for granted as a person. So like maybe XLA is more optimistic than me. I'm more like I see the problem, I want to solve the problem, kind of guy. But maybe I don't know. Peter, is a rose colored? Do you have sunglasses for us, actually?
No, I don't have tinted glasses. But I see people caring, and I see people pushing for meaningful change. Like first and foremost, like the bigger participants, like Osmosis, like very, very motivated to shield their users from the supposedly bad MEV with like deep technical changes. And that's the innovation that I was talking to earlier, right? Maybe some of that won't stick, but some will. And this is the part of the experimentation going forward. So I'm not positive. I just see that there is change to the ways the mempool is gonna work and be governed, changes to how things are secured, right? But there are always risks, as Brebs pointed out. So we have to work on those as well, and we have to be mindful over time and stepping stones, right? Small improvements and knowing that we just building towards a better future, hopefully.
Yeah, that's a good way, a very good way to put it. But last question, this, let's say we ignore this problem for too long and we end up in this worst case scenario. Would we be able to turn the ship around in form of innovation, or would it be too late when we enter this state? I just want to, I grew up in the times of climate change, like I'm this kind of generation. I want to see potential, potential.
No, so the good thing about Cosmos is like people just generally don't agree, and it's never been like contingent to being in Cosmos for an extended period of time. It's not like agreeing. It's always been an entropic space. It's always been a fracturing community. I think that's always been its strength. So even if it seems like completely rational an incentive to like centralize, people will find something to fight about in Cosmos. I have confidence in.
Yeah, what a lovely way to wrap this up. So it's never too late. Yeah, just wanted to spread some good vibes here.
Perfect.
Just to have a little bit of good vibes here, because and I can imagine how, and this is maybe also a problem about this topic, that it sounds very, very scary for people who are new to Cosmos or to crypto in general, that they are so excited about this ecosystem, then they hear something about the dark forest and that MEV eventually could destroy everything. So because of all these narratives, so I think it's very important.
An amazing thing about the dark forest is, right, it was the entrance of like a new participant in the ecosystem, like these robots, like these bots. What do they do? What do they care about? And the story of the dark forest is that they don't really care. They're kind of like they're incentive incompatible. They just like symbolically execute stuff and figure out what's profitable. And in certain cases, that's really, really bad. But in other cases, it's amazing. Like in the Rainbow Bridge hack, like the hacker was like fraud proofed because there was like these bots that were watching. Because of the dark forest, protocol designers have this new actor, in the space to design around. And it exactly as XLA said, is a forcing function to sort of advance our designs, to really consider the incentives. And it means like we need to look at like IBC relayers and being like, oh, some socialized pool of funds is not enough for the cost of running a validator, or subsidizing transactions or LPs with inflation is not a good idea, or that setting 14 cent or whatever low transaction fees is not good for the sustainability of the ecosystem. These are fantastic questions to ask, and it's good that our ecosystem is bringing this forward. So maybe like MEV is not about a fear, but sort of an activation over a richer set of questions that will design the next version of our ecosystem.
That's a very nice way to put in, also a very nice way to wrap up this interview a little bit. So last but not least, I know you're a very young project, so what is a very good way for people to interact with you guys, to learn more about Mekatek, to follow you on social media? So what are good ways to interact and get involved?
No, the only way to interact with us is to come see us in Medellin. Otherwise, we have no communication channels that are available or public. We accept bribes in the forms of Negronis, whatever. No, we do have a Twitter account.
We do have a Twitter account, yeah. We have a website, and we are also personally on Twitter. I think people can reach out to us as well. Yeah, but then there's no Discord or any one of these other platforms.
So the only way to talk to you guys is by taking an airplane and fly to Medellin, and be sure to have some money for some Negronis, in a nutshell.
Exactly. That's the floor price. Floor price is Negroni.
Floor price is Negroni. That's a take from this interview. With that said, so thank you, Sean. Thank you, XLA. All the best. And yeah, if you have any more questions, type them in the comment box below. We talked about some documentations. I will, of course, all link them in the description below. And with that being said, thank you for joining, guys. And also thanks for watching. And I hope I see you the next time.
Thanks for having us.